This old lady is Estelle. She was on an online dating site, trying to find herself a date. On the other hand, this old man is Brian. He chose the same criteria as Estelle, and in the end, they both matched. They agreed to meet at a bar and chatted, leading to a lunch date where they met in a cafe in London. At the start of the conversation, they shared stories about their failures in online dating. After a long heart-to-heart chat, Brian dared to be honest that his real name was Roy Courtnay, and it turned out that Estelle was also using a fake name. She told him that her real name was Betty McLeish. Their date went fast as Stephen, Betty's grandson, came to pick her up. Stephen always looked after his grandmother when he had free time amid his busy schedule in pursuing a PhD in history. Of course, he was happy to see his grandmother found a new partner. After Betty left, Roy immediately ordered a taxi not to go home, but to another place in the city to meet with 3 other people already waiting for him, namely Vincent, Roy's investment partner, and 2 investors named Bryn and his associate, Joe. Roy and Vincent made an investment invitation to Bryn and Joe where each of them was asked to invest 100,000 euros into one joint account amounting to 200,000 euros. They were promised a 50% profit within 6 months, and if they agreed, they would both be met by Russian bosses who were ready to invest 800,000 euros. At that moment, Roy was happy because Betty had just sent a message to him again, telling him to meet again that night. When they met, they watched a film about the past of Germany, but when they finished watching, Roy's legs suddenly felt very painful. Days later, Roy and Vincent were seen arranging a meeting where the Russian bosses, Bryn and Joe, would meet. They were meant to invest in one joint account with a total of 1 million euros. Initially, the conversation went smoothly with Vincent and Roy as Bryn and Joe's financial advisors. 200,000 euros had been transferred into a joint account. The Russian bosses were interested and said that they would invest 800,000 euros for a better return. But when the funds were about to be transferred, Bryn made a joke about Putin, making the Russian bosses silent. They glared at Bryn non-stop and left as they were no longer interested in investing, thanks to Bryn's out-of-place joke. After the meeting in the afternoon, Roy accidentally ran into Betty. She felt sorry for Roy because his legs were still hurt, so she gave him a ride to her house, a house that looked simple yet neatly arranged and warmly welcoming. They had a blast together until Stephen came. Stephen was confused as to why his grandmother brought someone she had just met to their house. Stephen repeatedly said that it was time for Roy to go home. Roy felt bad and finally went home, and Betty and Stephen gave him a ride, considering his hurt leg. Roy's apartment was a small room on the top floor. Doubting Roy's ability to walk, Stephen, who was cold to him, felt pity for him. In the end, Betty reprimanded Stephen and decided to invite Roy to stay overnight in her place. In the morning, Roy was sitting in front of Betty's house when he realized that a suspicious Audi seemed to be monitoring Betty's house. The person driving the car seemed to be looking at Roy non-stop, so he went back into the house. Inside, he heard Stephen arguing with his grandmother regarding Roy. After that, Betty pretended as if everything was normal, but Roy knew he tried to break the ice. What Roy did to break the ice made Betty think that Roy was a very charming man. Stephen seemed against his grandmother's view on the other hand. Betty then asked Stephen to always take Roy wherever he went, and Stephen couldn't refuse her order. Roy then said that he intended to go to the hospital to visit a friend from his youth who could no longer speak but could only hear. Stephen was asked whether he wanted to come along to visit, but he refused and said he would wait in the car. When Roy entered the hospital, Stephen immediately left, but it turned out that Roy came out again through the back door and immediately took off his coat. He walked normally like someone who didn't have leg pain, fit and healthy. He immediately attended the second meeting with Bryn and Joe. The Russian bosses had a meeting with him again, hoping that the investment could be completed without any problems like before. As compensation for his joke at the first meeting, Bryn said that he and Joe would increase their investment by 100,000 euros each, which meant the total of their capital would be 400,000 euros. The second meeting went smoothly without a problem, and both parties were happy, as were Roy and Vincent. Bryn was hugged by one of the Russian bosses, but suddenly, police were heard from outside the building. During that tense moment, Bryn found out that the Russian boss he hugged had a bug in his suit. The situation became out of control. The Russians had trapped them all, and there was no other way but to escape from the building. Joe and Bryn were the first two to escape, but after they left, the tension was nothing but a play. Roy and Vincent were amused by the two's behavior. The Russian bosses were also on Roy's side. Immediately, the balance of 400,000 belonging to Bryn and Joe was withdrawn by Roy. Roy was taken to Betty's house by Stephen as if nothing happened. Stephen then left again to go to his campus. At the same time, the suspicious Audi was again monitoring in front of Betty's house. Roy felt there was something strange, knowing someone he didn't know kept coming to monitor the house. Not wanting to keep this to himself, he told Vincent about it. Vincent advised him not to go out too often, afraid there could be a sniper hunting for him, but Roy instead felt challenged, especially since the place he was going to visit at this time was a butcher shop owned by a Polish, and he went with 3 thugs he had hired, along with Vincent. He went there to solve a complaint from the butcher, who turned out to be the Russian boss he hired to scam Bryn and Joe. The Polish butcher complained to Vincent that he should be given a share instead of payment for his role in the scam. Roy felt that 200,000 euros should be enough for him, but the Polish butcher refused it, so Roy asked his bodyguards to crush the Polish butcher's hand using the meat crusher, there to keep his mouth shut. Roy then invited Vincent to Betty's house to make Betty interested in their investment, and after the time arrived, Roy and Vincent acted as if they didn't know each other, more than Vincent being Roy's financial advisor. Roy surprisingly issued a bold statement that he would include Betty's name in his inheritance, replacing his only son, Robert, because he no longer cared about him, but Betty said that she had enough and refused the offer. When talking about assets, Roy immediately asked about the total value of all of Betty's assets. Amazingly, Betty's total assets were at 2.5 million euros. Vincent began explaining the investment he was offering. Roy himself had assets worth 1.3 million euros, which if combined with Betty's would be 3.8 million euros. Within 12 months, each of them would get a profit of 35% according to their respective portions, but somehow, Vincent's explanation did not make Betty interested in investing. She felt that she needed the money more to be always available for her, considering she was not young and her health condition might drop any given moment. Hearing what Betty said, Roy agreed, but he also emphasized for him. The most important thing was that he could spend time with Betty. Betty responded with a small laugh and reminded Roy of his leg's condition. Not long after that, Betty was shocked by a person who peeked through the kitchen window. Roy felt that someone was trying to harm any of them, considering the suspicious Audi who monitored the house and the person who just peeked through the kitchen window. Meanwhile, Vincent was more focused on finding a way to get Betty interested in investing. Of course, this goal was what Roy wanted to achieve. In the middle of their conversation, Stephen suddenly came home and expressed his disagreement on the investment, especially that came from someone his grandmother just met in less than a month. If this was a real investment, they should have let his grandmother think first, instead of approaching her several times. Betty was offended by what Stephen just said. She didn't know that her grandson could say those harsh words. In the end, Vincent left because he felt bad for the situation. Long story short, Betty started to feel more comfortable with Roy. One time, she gave Roy a haircut, but before he could finish her job, she fell and had difficulty standing. Roy took quite a long time to realize this, but luckily, Betty was able to meet her regular doctor after Roy took her. The doctor diagnosed that Betty had the potential to suffer a stroke. This was not good news, considering that Betty's age was very vulnerable to this. And this was also not good news for Roy, who was finding it increasingly harder to get Betty into investing. Betty was even more determined to refuse investment and preferred to save her money just in case she needed it. But from that incident, Betty instead invited Roy to go on an unplanned vacation to Germany. A day before the vacation, Roy accompanied Betty to shop for preparations for the vacation. Betty said that by going on a vacation, she felt more relaxed than when she had to just spend time at home. Without them realizing it, they were being monitored by someone who turned out to be Bryn. He had found out that Roy and Vincent had conned him, so he came to seek revenge. Roy, who was also aware that Bryn was following him, immediately invited Betty to enter one of the shops where he excused him to look for a toilet, even though what he was doing was to divert Bryn's attention. Roy went into the subway station where he continued walking until he reached a dead end. The only CCTV camera there was deliberately pointed up so as not to see his movements. After everything was done, Roy immediately attacked Bryn and pushed him towards a passing train. As a result, Bryn certainly died in an instant. Roy himself came out of the station casually and gave his coat to a busker. Not long after, the police headed to the subway while Roy came out casually. He came at the right time to meet Betty. No one was watching them anymore, and they could enjoy their vacation in Germany the very next day. In Germany, they had one goal, namely to meet Stephen, who was doing his research related to the history of Germany. Roy seemed confused when he heard Stephen occasionally explain things in German, but despite his confusion, he was entertained to see relics from the country's past. After returning, Roy decided to rest at the hotel. Betty herself had just returned after walking around for a while. Betty came home not in good condition. She accidentally fell and injured her palm while she was walking outside, so Roy immediately treated her hands. His care and affection made Betty fall in love more with him. She no longer doubted Roy now. Long story short, they returned to England. Surprisingly, Betty said that she would agree to invest. She made this decision without any coercion from anyone. Vincent immediately met Roy, who was busy emptying things in his apartment to round up his total assets at 1.3 million. He intended to withdraw the total funds invested by Betty. Vincent suggested that at least he leave a little of her assets, considering that Betty was not in her best condition, but Roy firmly said that he didn't care. He was only thinking about enjoying the money while drinking champagne on the beach. The day of the meeting arrived. Betty was ready to sign the waiver, and so was Roy. Vincent once again confirmed that their money would be put into one account and only the two of them could access it via a keypad, which could be taken anywhere. From here, Betty would get a larger portion of the investment returns. At first, everything went smoothly, but suddenly, Betty started to doubt whether she should invest all her money, remembering her not-do-good health condition. To convince Betty, Roy was determined to invest all his assets. Seeing that, Betty had complete trust and immediately transferred all her assets into the mutual account. For the password, Vincent asked for 6 letters that Roy and Betty mutually agreed. Betty seemed to be attracted to the flower painting that was displayed there, showing a lily. From that, the 6 letters that were agreed upon were formed, namely lilies. This was the happiest day for Vincent and Roy. Betty didn't know that Roy and Vincent had just scammed her. That same day after the meeting, Roy immediately packed up his things and was going to leave Betty's house. The only reason he used was his son Robert that he would visit after getting a call from France. Betty kindly agreed to his departure. Smartly, at moments like this, Roy tried to assure her that he didn't want to leave by saying that he was more comfortable with her, and that seemed to have convinced her. Betty grew to love Roy even more and believed that he was a true gentleman. Long story short, Roy was in his new apartment in France and was just spending time alone. Vincent hadn't gotten his share yet, but Roy had enjoyed everything while drinking champagne in an empty room, until one day when Roy couldn't find his keypad. After searching endlessly, he still couldn't find it. He panicked and immediately called the bank. He tried to access the account without the keypad, but the bank refused. Strange for Roy because he couldn't have forgotten to bring the keypad. Like it or not, he had to go back to Betty's house to check. He came in the middle of the night to avoid suspicion, but there was something strange. The house was empty. There was nothing besides Betty sitting in an empty room. It turned out that Betty was holding Roy's keypad, where currently she was deducting 50,000 euros from each balance for one lie that Roy made. Amazingly, all of Roy's lies had been calculated since the beginning of their chat. She had found out that Roy didn't have a son. So before he left, she secretly took his keypad. She knew that the only reason that made Roy return was the keypad. There was no way Roy would come back only to meet her. Betty also revealed her true identity, that she was not Betty. When they created a joint account password, the code they shared referring to the lily painting that was displayed was the clue. Her real name was Lily. She was a German. Suddenly, Roy remembered something. Roy himself was not his real name. His real name was Hans, a German, which meant it was impossible for him not to understand German. At the age of 15, Hans was invited by Lily's parents to teach her English because Hans was fluent in English from a young age and came from a rich family background. Hans knew that Lily's father was a Nazi criminal. At first, everything went well, but not after Hans saw Lily's 3 older sisters dancing in the music room. They were much older than him. Hans secretly walked in, but his presence was immediately noticed and he was invited to dance together by one of them. At that moment, Hans was aroused by one of them and his gaze lasted long enough for the girl to feel uncomfortable. Hans suddenly became violent. When he saw Lily, who at that time was amazed by him thanks to his ability to speak English, he did the unthinkable. He cornered her and raped her. Not long after this happened, Lily's mother heard the noise and Hans was called to explain what just happened. When asked, Hans made up a story that Lily and her sisters were the ones who started the ruckus. Lily didn't have any respect for him anymore and she refused to speak to him at all. She just watched her father throw Hans out, but 2 days later, Hans slandered her father and he was arrested. Her mother couldn't stand the situation and decided to commit suicide. Her sisters then died in an explosion that happened during the war, while Lily herself managed to survive after fleeing to England as an illegal immigrant. Lily also explained about Stephen. Stephen had graduated with a PhD in history long ago, and he was assigned by her to investigate Hans' background since 5 last year, long before she and Hans met after the incident in her childhood. As a result, what Hans had done had been revealed since the first meeting. It also turned out that Stephen was not her grandson, but her real grandson's boyfriend, while her real grandson was the person who Hans suspected, the man in the Audi who was seen in front of the house to monitor him. As for Vincent, he had been threatened by Stephen with his crime in the past, and with that, Vincent no longer be on Hans' side, and everything that Hans said to him was immediately conveyed in detail to Lily. For the wound that Lily got in German, the reason was related to this. She deliberately came to her old house, which had become a charity for children. She went to her former bedroom, which had become a library. On one of the tiles was this one thing that she kept, and when she opened the tile, she was in such a hurry that her hands were scratched by scattered nails. What she had been keeping, there was a strand of Hans' hair when she was raped by Hans. For the new sample of his hair, she got it when she cut his hair. She then did a DNA test, and the result proved her suspicion that the man in front of her was indeed the boy who had ruined her family and life. Her fainting where she cut his hair turned out to be fake. Even the doctor who diagnosed her was a paid actor. She was very healthy, even much healthier than Hans himself. There was a reason why she faked her health, nothing but to provoke Hans to go all in on the investment, which meant that she could withdraw all his money. Her house was designed specifically to deceive Han. She deliberately gave the house a comfortable and warm vibe to make it like she was an easy victim to scam. Hans immediately begged for forgiveness, but Lily said that she had forgiven him. She then returned Hans a keypad, not after deliberately leaving only 100,000 euros in the account while she had transferred the rest to an account that Hans couldn't access. Before leaving, Lily had brought two guests that Hans had scammed. They were Joe and the polish butcher. The money left in the account was not enough to pay them both, so that night, Lily's departure from the house was accompanied by screams from Hans, who was beaten mercilessly. Long story short, Vince was seen at the hospital, on his way to meet Hans in his room. Hans could no longer speak. He had reaped what he sowed. Vincent then gave him a glass of water and told him to pretend that the water was champagne. His room had been decorated with a beach in the background, and while accompanied by Vincent for the last time, Hans was made to feel his desire as if he was drinking champagne on the beach, but in the worst possible way. On the other hand, Lily lived happily with her extended family. She was reminded of her sister when she saw the 3 children of her grandchildren.